But now, Viljar Peep from the Data Protection Inspectorate, he will talk about using and reusing data and developing machine translation. I'm sure you all have questions. What data can be handed out in order to do this? Often it seems as if the case is that nothing can be handed out. The real answers will follow now. Ladies and gentlemen, during the New Year's era, we heard that the most popular Estonian TV show Tujurikkuja will ruin or stop ruining Christmases, meaning their name translates to mood ruiner. It's a good news. There's a new facet to it. I am the new mood ruiner, the new Tujurikkuja. I will try to make things even muddier and even less transparent. This is why we have people who are specialized in law. A little bit of legal talk. First, what are the bases and what should be implemented? How to look for answers if you have questions, for example, regarding how to feed a lot of data into the machine. We always point towards directives, but these aren't always uniformly usable. It's not the Data Protection Act nor the Public Information Act, but we base our framework on these two things. And this is where the rules come to an end also. As far as these big data sets have personal data, which would enable to recognize a person, then this is a situation where the Data Protection Act comes into play. The aim and point of this law is that there needs to be a justified reason why data is being collected, forwarded, input, that there need to be there's also further stipulations such as minimalism. You need to collect the bare minimum of data. In addition to that, the person whose data is being handled needs to be notified in cases where they have questions. The questions need answers, and if they have anything against it, you also need to communicate with these people. This is a really short summary of the first law, and this really it has to do with view or machine translation only in the case where it involves personal data from people. But if it's any sort of public entity, then their privacy is not being protected, and that's not an issue at the moment. But at the moment, it's the Public Information Act, which was already passed 15 years ago by the Estonian government. This is where most of the stipulations come from. This means that the public information and who can access it is limited. If we look at the terms used in conjunction with this are numerous. The spectrum of terms is really broad. It's maybe not the most precise, but because if we talk about information from the public sector, then for example in Estonia the term public information includes public services. It's not secret information. Most of the information really has some limitations when people can access it, but these are public information. This is public information from public entities. This means there should be access to it without limit. In the German-speaking world, they speak of information freedom of information. In Spanish-speaking countries, it's transparencia. There is a lot of terms used for the same principle. Also requests for information where people pose questions and get answers from institutions. This information is being made available for people using modern methods. This means uploaded onto the internet, and this means that the request for information has been granted when it's put online. But this is not what can be done is only one side. There's also a lot of limitations. Everyone working in the field knows that there's always a lot of limitations. There's a lot of data that has been branded non-public. In Estonia, it also means that we have a framework of laws and regulations for data sets. For example, with machine or automatic translation, it doesn't mean that you can go to different web pages of different institutions in Estonia and just download their data sets. There are rules and regulations when it comes to keeping the data registries. But life moves on, so do the rules and laws and acts. The European Commission made a lot of fuss recently about the directive for reusing data hasn't been implemented in Estonia, and they threatened with a court case. I would have disagreed, and I would say that even this 12 years of practice that we had, it was quite evident that granting a request for information meant that the person who made the request, if they have the right to access this information, they get this information. Do we need to apply this term of reusing data? This is questionable. They went the route of easier resistance, and in 2012 it was amended. But to be honest, it created more confusion than actually simplified things. They also took the easiest route when wording the act. And the Public Information Act in Estonia is rather small, rather short, and it includes a list of data that must be made public. For example, public officers' names, etc. It's a long list of things that must be public, and that they took the easiest route was mainly due to laziness. They just said that whatever is written on the homepage is data that is free for reusing, and this, in turn created more problems than it solved. When putting together this point in the act, then they disregarded the central part of the law, which was created in the late 90s, where the term search engine was still a foreign word and no one knew what it was. So at the moment, getting information is possible via a request for information or just surfing on the web pages. But these are things that people didn't think back then in the late 90s. That they didn't pay attention to what this releasing information on web pages, what it really means. But most public servants are relatively thick-skinned, so they don't care whether their personal information and where they studied is public information or not. But it can also bring in a new host of problems. For example, if you've been if you've been charged with a crime, the statute of limitation should come into play at some point. But with these public registries, of course, at certain points it may be necessary that at some point it is necessary to be public. For example, if a person Googles themselves, and if they find out that, oh, I have a court date set, or and this is information that really is relatively short term. For example, the case can be thrown out of court because it wasn't justified, but this information, which has already been made public, which is still stored on the internet, it is still available there. And this list of examples could be continued for a while. So starting with January 2016, we had a lot of new regulations, some of which were positive, some of which not so much. C'est la vie, as the French said. I am not going to talk about copyright, I'm not going to talk about licensing, but this is also part of the problem that need to be overcome. And there is another addendum which was added in 2016. I was fighting heroically against it, but I wasn't too successful. Licensing, really. Usually there's a licensing disclaimer. It stems from the United Kingdom, I guess. There's always the copyright of the crown. Registries belong to the Queen. Ministers' speeches made publicly are the Queen's. Everything belongs to the Queen. And even if you have the right to use it for free, you still have to have the license. And for a while, this licensing thing wasn't as transparent, as easy. But this licensing thing is quite widespread, especially when we're talking about multilateral actions. Then we need to know whether there are limitations. And this is a classical example of licensing is copyright. And I don't think our public services have copyright in the classical sense of the word. But this created some confusion, especially in Estonia. Estonians using the services, especially if they know about licensing, they know whether the license is there or not, and doesn't really have much of a role anyway. You just need to know the basis of the law. But it's something that was added on starting January, and it's something that we aren't really all that interested in, to be honest. To move on, what is the basis for reusing private data? If we leave all this licensing and copyright besides, then a question for you, ladies and gentlemen, if we talk about public information, which has more value, the Data Protection Act or the Public Information Act? If there are two laws which basically regulate the same matter, then one of the logical ways to approach it is here's on the one hand we have the general law and then we have additional laws. But how do you see it? Which is the main law, which is a specialized law? Is it the Data Protection Act? Is it the Public Information Act? Especially when we consider this big data that you get for feeding into your machine translating machines. I hear the same always, and everyone is always wrong. The Data Protection Act is a good example of a general law. It regulates what are the general principles of handling private data. It can be whether per agreement or according to the law. Which law is it? Is it the Police and Border Guard Act or Credit Act? There's a host of different acts and laws. But if we talk about the Public Information Act, then this is just one of these specialized laws which regulates the basis and the rules of using public information, public data. But this is relatively generalized. Of course, there are examples where the rule doesn't apply, but in general, this is what it is like. And the two of them need to be viewed in conjunction. A lot of these more modern laws where they regulate certain or this field in Canada or Hungary, where they have taken these two and made it one. So they have one law which protects private data as well as public data. But here it is quite of a riddle how to make the two fit together. I would like to keep bombarding you with questions. You have gotten a lot of data from some data set that's being created and maintained by some institution. There's private data, there's names, marital statuses, etc. So what is the... Let's just think for a moment that you got it in a legal way. What is the legal basis for you to use it? Try to think like lawyers. What agreement? That's ridiculous. I'm not going to give you. I'm not going to agree it. You got my information from some registry, and now you're asking for my approval of data being used. This is quite right. Whether to you keep using the data that has been procured through public information, reusing it, how is it regulated? Does it need approval or not when it's done on other bases as originally, be it commercial or whatever? This is something that has been discussed a lot in different countries, and I'm sorry, the interpreter can't hear without the microphone. If I have the right to just gander at it, but if I start collecting the data, adding new data to it, adding new information to it, and then sell it, for example, then of course this is not covered in the Public Information Act anymore. But there's also another school of thought which says that, such as it is regulated in the Estonian law, then granting access to data, then it already is enough approval for use. If you have a data set taken from some registry and my personal data is in it, then how can you use it? But it is already in the data set. So, but this also is something that is still on a theoretical basis and hasn't really been tested too much. But we don't need to look for this basis, because for machine translating we don't need the names, we don't need this private data. I haven't gotten there yet. But in principle, yes, for machine translation, it's my name is not necessary, my private data is not necessary. But when we talk in general, if we have information from the public sector, for example, the business registry is also public, credit information, there's what's happening often is that people copy the entire registry and start using it. But there are certain databases that have a lot of personal information. For example, even if you look at the official notice newspaper Riigi Teataja, then even that, it has the first and last name. It is personal data. Even though we do know that it's not data that could be protected anyway. But if we have data sets that have gone from the gone over to the private sector, then it, on the one hand, it seems as if you have the data, then you have the right to use it also. If you have procured the right to the data, then you have the right to use it, including everything. And this is one of the views. There's also demands on how personal data can be processed. There's a stipulation that says you can do it if there's a solid basis for it, which has also been anchored into the law. But if the question is passing it on to third parties or granting access to the third parties, then there's another stipulation which is much more narrow and not as forgiving. There's just one idea that can be really taken into account, and it is if it's public data which comes from the public sector, it doesn't have any personal private data, then you can pass it on to the third parties for use. And this is the legal basis, legal framework on which we base our actions on. But when we talk about limiting the use and reuse of data, then there's a host of filters in between. The filters need to filter out what can be used, what cannot be used, and that they should be also able to take away the parts which cannot be reused. Within our inspectorate, we wear a lot of different hats. We have a lot of different things we have to deal with. We have to try and keep an eye on when limited data sets are passed on. We have to ensure the protection of people's privacy, etc. And now, starting out with this year, we have to also keep an eye on the maintenance of data sets in general. So we have a lot of tasks. And also we need to keep an eye on whether data sets are being passed on or not. And this all demands something that might be complicated thinking. There are limitations, there are data sets where it's easy to say that this applies, there's no second guessing. For example, the census registry. It's not a public data set. It is only meant for the institutions that actually have to use it. Of course, there is interest, but there's no circumventing it. For example, the business registry is public. So these are different data sets, and the build of it has been prescribed. How public can it be? And then there are things that are in between, which demand that you actually apply critical thought. And that can actually be quite complicated every now and then. On the one hand, it's easy to say, what's so complicated there? Just look at the Data Protection Act. You have a lot of, you have the list and you can double check it. It's on page 35. point 12. You can just look it up. It says if data is not public, if it can influence this sacred private life of a person in a meaningful way. This is made of rubber. You can stretch it every which way. We have tried making it better. We have made a guideline for public information, and we have tried to explain in simple terms what should be public, what shouldn't be public. For example, business secrets. These are really, again, hazy divisions, what's public, what's not. But starting January this year, we have even new additional rules and limitations. This list of limitations is still open-ended. There can be additions made, and we have also checked the list against real life, and there are roughly 200 which aren't really used at all. 80 were actually enforced. If the Constitution says that something is a basic right of a human, then this obviously cannot be violated. But everything else is up for interpretation. So if we try to navigate towards the data and try not to run into any of these limitations, then of course we can well, in addition to posing a request for information, we can also pose a request for reusing information. But the data, the question is about the data set in general. If we can download it, if we can use it as a whole or not. This is where certain limitations again come into play. And of course there are also so-called discomfort limitations. Generally, registries should be easily accessible and easily usable. But for example, copyright can pose problems in that sense. In many cases we use this international scale. It's divided up into 5 stars. 1 star is extremely uncomfortable to use, extremely intransparent, and 5 is transparent, which you can fully download and start using. There's a lot which also falls between, and the goal is not to become too comfortable. I think, of course, you should be able to access information in a quick and timely manner, but you shouldn't be able to access and download everything in the data set. And for the data managers and the institutions, they need to take a look at the information that they store. They need to look at their data sets, and they need to make decisions. The decisions that need to be made is whether it should be downloadable by machine or not, or maybe depersonalize the data sets. These depersonalized data sets are perhaps the way to go, because then you can't really access any personal information. But these are the legal frameworks in brief. Hopefully I helped to create a little bit of clarity, but on the other side, I hope I also emphasized how complicated things really are. You don't have any questions, do you? Thought so.
minul on nüüd küsimus ikkagi.
I have a question. What about research use of data? To use these types of data for research purposes, who do you ask for permission? A researcher? Or, for example, if a researcher wants to use some data, let's say to develop MT, and the researcher asks for information that is already publicly available on a website, but they want additional, let's say, data. They want to use the whole data set. Do they have to ask for a separate permission, and whom do they ask? I was really hoping not to make things too confused for you, and I think you opened a Pandora's box here. Here again we come into the question of how these two acts work together and which should be used as a legal basis. If you, let's say, put a robot to work and they gather publicly available information from websites that is not, and the data is not limited in any way, then go right ahead. It's public information because it's available without limitation, and in that case, go right ahead. But then there is a paragraph in the Data Protection Act that talks about research and the type of research studies where you need consent. Let's just look at the paragraph that talks about research. Here we have a situation where for research, in any case, research is done for the purposes of science. I don't have any very clear examples for you right now, but personal data is used for research without consent and without basis. So research is just done for the sake of science. In applied science, it may imply other things, for example, commercial interests. But you don't have any consents and you don't have any special legal basis. Then you would have to turn to the Data Protection Inspectorate and ask them for permission. But when it comes to science, then the definition is something that is challenging as well. For example, at some point they said that it was believed that history is not a science. So what is statistics? What is science? It's quite hazy. But if you're taking masses and masses of information and just feeding it into a machine that generates generalizations in the end, and then it is reasonable to ask for permission. But of course, it is always possible to depersonalize the data, and in that case, you avoid problems. When it comes to machine translation, it means that you're using collections of data that have not been depersonalized, right? So under the paragraph, you're asking for permission, and then those granting permission have to evaluate whether what your output will be, whether that will contain any information that will lead back to persons or not. And based on that, they will have to either give permission or reject your request. So it is a very complicated procedure and a complicated question, but it is possible. I'm scared about you finding some more loopholes or some gray areas in these laws. But in any case, depersonalized data, if it's publicly available,